good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken was last week embarked on his first visit to Southeast Asia since President Joe Biden took office in January. America's top diplomat visited Indonesia and Malaysia in a trip that was said to be aimed at shoring up relations amid growing influence from China. How do we best understand the emerging regional geopolitical dynamics that Malaysia now needs to negotiate? Let's begin with our first guest, Elena No. She's Director of Political Security Affairs at the Asia Society Policy Institute. She's also the Deputy Director of its Washington, D.C. office. Elena, Blinken's visit to Southeast Asia and to Malaysia, it comes on the heels of Biden's Summit for Democracy Summit. And I'm just wondering whether the Democracy Summit actually framed Blinken's visit here to Malaysia.
No, I don't think it directly did. This was in the works for a long time, I believe. The Biden administration coming into office earlier in the year had indicated that it would be back in the world, back in the region. It has just taken a little longer for the Secretary of State to come to the region. But I think there were larger considerations, and part of that was the realization in Washington that this administration had to refocus on what it calls the Indo-Pacific, including the Southeast Asian region. And I think it also realizes, judging from the rhetoric of the Secretary of State, that the region, Southeast Asia, is important not just in its larger strategic framing with China, but also for its own sake. And you see some of those points coming out in some of Secretary Blinken's visits and remarks in Malaysia.
Elena, can you tell us a little bit about this concern about the depth of U.S. re-engagement with the region? We know, of course, that Vice President Kamala Harris was in Singapore and Vietnam. Also, Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman was also in the region. So is this all a sign that things are going to get better, or there's going to be a deeper connection between how the U.S. sees itself in the world and especially its relationship with Southeast Asian nations?
So there's certainly an intention to deepen those connections with Southeast Asia, and that has manifested in the rhetoric of many of the officials who visited the region. What is lacking so far, I think, is the details of that intention and how it's going to be operationalized. There is a lot of commitment that has been made to the region, talking about connections in the digital economy, enhancing the resiliency of supply chains, et cetera, And a lot of those commitments are wide-ranging, but the depth is lacking. Because, for example, we've heard this talk about an economic framework for the region. We don't know yet what that economic framework will look like. I believe the administration is working on that. We're also still waiting on a full-fledged national security strategy, an updated version from the Biden administration. And despite the multiple visits by these senior officials, what we've seen is a pattern of going back to the same countries. So Singapore and Vietnam have seemed to be the favorites for some of these officials. It was Secretary Blinken's first visit to Indonesia and Malaysia, although he has engaged, of course, with countries in the region virtually. But we're really waiting to unpack some of the operational details of what the administration, almost 1 year on into office, has talked a lot about re-engaging with the region.
Are there any details, Elena, on that note? Because, I'm just wondering if it was announced some of these commitments to this region, is it worth, say, comparing Secretary Blinken's speeches delivered in Indonesia and in Malaysia? He had to cut the trip short, didn't actually go to Thailand. But is it worth looking at what he did say to find more meat about the details?
I think the most meat has really been in the pandemic or, the global public health area. So the fact that the U.S. has donated vaccines to the region, in the past few months especially has been very welcome, and there have been concrete numbers, right, in the range of millions of doses from the US. But other than that, what the region, Southeast Asia, is really looking for and is excited to hear more about is the details of an economic framework. Because remember, the US pulled out of the CPTPP, and the region is marching on without the US with the CPTPP, with RCEP, with other trade frameworks. Of course, the US has bilateral arrangements, but in engaging the region as a whole, especially coming out of this pandemic and looking to really boost the economic recovery of these countries, I think the region is really looking for those details from the United States, which is still unfortunately trying to work them out. So beyond global public health, we haven't unfortunately really seen very many details, and those are still sketchy.
Alina, some observers, kind of frame it this way. They talk about what you just said, a sustainable geo-economic agenda for the U.S. as it re-engages different parts of the world. But it also talks about the U.S. in terms of its internal political dysfunction. And they kind of put that together, that, that China in its rivalry, the U.S. in its rivalry with China has to consider these two elements. Not just what it can offer the world, but what it needs to do internally. Is that, do you think, a valuable perspective?
Oh, certainly. The domestic aspect of some of these foreign policy considerations is key, particularly given how divided the United States is politically and in Congress. So a concrete example is that some of the ambassadorial nominations have been held up for Senate confirmation because there have been other deals that have been pending. And so some of these ambassadors have not been able to be confirmed to be sent out to the regions. Southeast Asia, of course, has been impacted by this. And the fact that we are in the United States coming up to congressional elections very soon, there's this cycle every 2 years, it's constantly an election cycle. But also, I think in addition to the domestic aspect is the fact that the US has also been distracted foreign policy-wise in other areas. So in the early days of the Biden administration, not only did they have to deal with internal divides, partisan divides, but also still raging pandemic. And then Afghanistan happened, and now Tigray in Ethiopia. So there have been a range of competing priorities that have unfortunately, I think, slowed down this re-engagement with Southeast Asia that seemed so promised earlier on in the Biden administration.
Can I ask you, Alina, what is, under the Biden administration's foreign policy regime, what is the desired outcome for a relationship with the Indo-Pacific region?
That's a really good question. So for a long time, there was this veneer of China overshadowing the U.S. engagement with Southeast Asia. A lot of that has been tempered and muted through the rhetoric, at least, of senior officials who've come out to the region. Blinken himself had said when he was out in Southeast Asia that Southeast Asia is important for its own sake. And I think this is important because it shows that the administration is listening to pleas and urges from Southeast Asia to this very point. But beyond that, I think also the administration recognizes that there is truth in this, and the U.S.'s future lies in a successful and prosperous Southeast Asia, larger Asia Pacific. And so the China piece aside, it's still a very, very important piece. This administration at least recognizes that it needs to engage Southeast Asia on its own merits. Now, whether or not that will prevail is still a question to be answered. And that's why the details of some of these promises are very important.
Lena, can we talk about Myanmar? Because I think it was mentioned by Secretary Blinken that the U.S. was looking to help Myanmar return to that path to democracy. How will U.S. policy on Myanmar impact the region, especially as we see a region it's somewhat divided, and many countries and their and companies in these countries, including Malaysia, continue to engage with the Myanmar junta, seeking profits there. Do you see that coming to the fore anytime soon?
So I think this Biden administration has been very sensitive to this whole concept of ASEAN centrality. You see it repeated over and over again in statements released from the White House, from other senior officials. And part of that is seen through the fact that the United States has basically left leadership of the Myanmar crisis to ASEAN itself. And so it's taken a back seat in a way, the US has, but it's also, I think, continued a parallel engagement in terms of just going ahead with its own policies, enacting targeted sanctions against the junta military, the junta members individually and as a group as well. And so what you see is this kind of dual track approach from the United States where they sort of cede leadership in the region to ASEAN. Whether or not ASEAN has been successful, of course, we can debate, but it's also gone its own way in terms of sanctions and I think engaging very quietly with NUG members as well.
Ellen, just a last question for you about possible tensions in the South China Sea. Do you think potential flashpoints might alter the kind of straddling, the two giants kind of strategy that a country like Malaysia takes, trying not to displease either side? Do you see the possibility of conflict and us having to negotiate that?
I think there's a real possibility of miscalculation. And I think Malaysia has tried to articulate this, sometimes well, sometimes not so well. The fact that there are increasingly a number of external players in the South China Sea looking to jostle against each other in the name of international law is disconcerting because now the dispute is more than just a regional territorial dispute. It's become a great power flashpoint, as you pointed out, Sharad. And so I think what Malaysia will have to do moving forward is to really navigate these treacherous waters. Apologies for the bad pun, but the potential for this, deteriorating into something completely miscalculated because of rising tensions is very real. And so we'll have to do some creative diplomacy, but we'll also have to be very proactive in negotiating not only the code of conduct, but also in managing our bilateral relations separately with China and the United States, but also with other powers that are closely aligned with the United States on the South China Sea.
Alina, thank you so much for sharing those insights. That was foreign policy analyst Alina Ngo of the Asia Society Policy Institute. We're going to take a quick break here and consider this, but stay tuned. We'll be back with more.
Kes masih tinggi. Amalkan kebersihan yang baik. Basuh tangan dengan Lifebuoy atau sabun. Kuasa melindungi Malaysia kini di tangan anda. Kita jaga kita.
Kopi kering beku Makona dengan rasa halus serta aroma.
Amanah di tangan kita. Adat, budaya dan semangat menjadi kesinambungan perpaduan tanah air yang tercinta. Berteraskan adab yang terpahat di jiwa dan raga. Marilah bersama kita membina negara Malaysia.
Semua yang terjadi adalah berita, tetapi tiada siapa yang boleh bawakan yang terkini dan tergempar seperti kami.
Dilihat hanya memberi wang tanpa matlamat yang tepat.
Dia tidak melakukan apa-apa kesalahan.
Untuk mendapatkan jawapan yang bermakna, kita perlu soalan yang tepat.
Amat sedih dengan apa yang berlaku ke atas.
Tiada ruang untuk berita palsu.
Negara kita telah merekodkan kes harian baru sebanyak
hanya fakta yang diberikan.
Amat penting untuk meneruskan perjuangan negara melawan pandemik ini.
Sentiasa memastikan suara anda, suara rakyat didengari.
Kenapa?
Membawakan apa yang penting di mana sahaja anda berada.
Kerana kita hendak putuskan rantaian jangkitan.
Belanjawan dan pendekatan bertemakan survival ini secara keseluruhan.
Teruskan bersama kami, Astro AWANI, saluran berita yang paling dipercayai rakyat Malaysia.
Hi, thank you so much for staying with Shran and I on Consider This. Let's continue a discussion about diplomacy and foreign policy. How do we best understand US Secretary of State Antony Blinken's recent visit to this region and the emerging regional geopolitical dynamics that we need to negotiate? Let's speak now to Thomas Daniel. He's a fellow in the Foreign Policy and Security Studies program at ISIS Malaysia. Thomas, can we begin our conversation by taking a look at the significance of Secretary Blinken's visit last week? You know, some commentators are saying that Joe Biden's administration had been slow-footed in its diplomatic engagement with this region, with Southeast Asia. But I'm just wondering, I mean, belated it may be, what was the significance, you think, of the Blinken visit, and was that charm offensive in the region successful, in your opinion?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I guess, I do share the view that perhaps was a slightly slowish start by officials in the Biden administration, but we can get to that later. I think a visit by a diplomat-in-chief, if you will, is always significant. What more if it comes from a major global power and a partner nation to Malaysia. I would really frame this in terms of substance and optics, right? So in terms of substance, the United States is a long-standing partner of Malaysia, and it's likely to remain an attractive and a crucial diplomatic and developmental partner to this country. I think in terms of the substance, we saw from the statements and the readouts that both sides, are seeking collaboration in across a range of areas. You've got, the very obvious public health mentioned, but you have also mentioned supply chains and the digital economy. I think another key area that came up were conversations on sustainability and access to technology pertaining to clean energy. While he was here, Blinken didn't just meet with his counterpart in Wisma and the PM. He also had a roundtable with the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, and the announcement of a power sector program where the U.S. would facilitate higher quality clean energy engagement. So I think this really sort of speaks to the importance of the bilateral relationship, where engagement really happens on issues that are important to Malaysia that we want to discuss, and not everything is sort of focused on sort of wider regional concerns. In terms of optics,
Thomas, sorry, Thomas. Before we get to that, I want to ask you if there are some sticky points in our relationships or problematic areas. So I'm thinking of the trafficking in persons report. I believe that Malaysia got a downgrade. I mean, I believe at the lowest tier at this point in time.
Yes,
Do those things impact bilateral relations? Because it does have an impact on how Malaysia can be co-opted into certain types of policy framework. I remember during the TPP, this was a big issue. With that downgrade or third-tier, status. Sure. You couldn't be, say, part of some sort of fast tracking. So, what can you kind of walk us through some of the pain points in our relationship with the U.S.?
Sure. I actually think that, at the core, the relationship is actually a pretty functional one. So it doesn't mean that there aren't any issues. And actually, the issue that actually comes up right up to the top of my mind would be, the increasing scrutiny and import bans by American authorities over forced labor and other exploitative labor practices in this country. So there have been multiple warnings by stakeholders over the years. Now, foreign authorities and foreign companies, are starting to act. I would say, however, I don't foresee it complicating bilateral ties too much in the short term. There is no indication of that for now. I think just like with China, the U.S. and Malaysia are pretty good at compartmentalizing ties together. And, differences and difficulties in one area doesn't mean the whole relationship is affected. However, I would also add that in the longer run, it could certainly create complications, especially if we continue to remain in Tier 3 of the Trafficking in Persons report, and if we continue to really sort of project a very appalling track record in the treatment of migrant labor. There is significant reputational damage here, which could affect prospects for sort of trade relations at a time when we need to negotiate new FTAs with key Western partners. It could affect foreign investment into Malaysia, especially coming from the US, which is a major source of foreign investment into Malaysia. Given that the global private sector, especially in the US, is now prioritizing ESG criteria. And lastly, another area that could be affected when it comes to the U.S. is that of military assistance. So the U.S. is a significant provider of military assistance and cooperation with Malaysia. And if we remain in Tier 3 in the long run, and if we continue to not significantly address these practices, then we could see these issues sort of bleed out into other aspects of the bilateral. Yeah.
Right. Thomas, you mentioned a little bit earlier looking at it from a substance versus optics perspective. And we spoke to Alina No, based in Washington a bit earlier, and she pointed out that while there's been a kind of renewed commitment by the Biden administration to this region, there's been a lack of details about what the commitments entail. And I'm just wondering, if we were to take a look at, say, the optics of it, has the episodic attention of Washington to this region, to Southeast Asia, been enough? Has the U.S. gained ground here without providing the details in terms of its commitment, as mentioned by Alina?
Sure. I would actually agree with Alina here, where I think the lack of details is going to be an issue in the long term. I think, what most in Southeast Asia really want is they want sort of firm signs of U.S. commitment, and that commitment has to come with sort of long-term plans and sort of really feasible long-term plans that can be worked out and implemented. However, the cynical part of me will also say that in Southeast Asia, showing up is sort of half the battle won. And after a relatively slow start by the Biden administration, I think the past 6 months, you've seen a slew of high-profile visits. You've seen the Vice President, you've seen the Secretary of Defense, you've seen the Deputy Secretary of State. In Malaysia itself, there was the Secretary of Commerce, which didn't really go, which wasn't as well reported as Secretary Blinken's visit. But that was a very productive visit with sort of substantial discussions with NITI. So I think the fact that you have an administration who realizes that you do need to engage, and that part of engaging is actually showing up and to have those conversations, to renew those relationships, is a positive sign, especially coming from the administration that Biden just replaced.
Yeah, Thomas, can you help us think through this issue of this observation that the U.S. needs an economic strategy in Southeast Asia? When you think of China as a kind of the political structure of China and its economic strength and how we can deploy that, the U.S. is a very different creature. I mean, it's essentially the free market that operates there, right? So how exactly? I mean, can we compare China to the U.S. in terms of an economic strategy in Southeast Asia?
Absolutely, and this is really one of the fundamental challenges that not just the U.S. but perhaps other countries in Asia and in Europe face when it comes to when it comes to engaging with the Asia Pacific. I think Asia Pacific, especially the developing Asia Pacific, is extremely hungry for infrastructure investment, for investment across a bunch of key areas. And not everyone can pick up the phone and to order, the president of a state-linked company to invest billions of dollars in a country with the sort of vague promise that it will be made up later. No American president can call Exxon and tell them to put in $1 billion into Malaysia, for example. It doesn't work that way. So trying to find that balance and trying to find a way through there has been a real challenge. I think one of the interesting ways that the Americans have been trying to get around this is to act as a facilitator, whereby they would help facilitate countries in the Asia Pacific to sort of have the right sort of policies, the right sort of conditions on the ground to be able to attract American investment. There have been talk of the U.S. government, at least under the previous Trump administration, coming up with a sort of fiscal guarantee or backing for American companies that were to invest in certain developing regions of the Indo-Pacific. So what is needed is really creative solutions. I don't think the Americans or anyone else can sort of compete with China on its own game. That's not the way to go. And trying to find those creative solutions will be the real challenge, which is why it's really taken it's taken so long for any kind of large scale rollout, because I think folks are still trying to find out what that right approach is.
All right. On that note, I'm thinking about the bilateral issues between our two countries that perhaps need addressing. And I'm wondering whether there are opportunities there in terms of, addressing and resolving some of these bilateral issues that might, in fact, deepen or strengthen the relationship.
Sure. I think, I think really one way which I would sort of frame the bilateral relationship really is that it is a bilateral relationship that is essentially very, very functional. The relationship has been framed as a strategic partnership since 2014 that covers a variety of factors, so there are long established and well structured mechanisms in place that allow for most of the issues to be dealt with by professional diplomats or bureaucrats without the overt participation of senior political policymakers or cabinet members. As to sort of what might strengthen it, I think it might be time for political leaders on both sides to start considering whether we need to elevate the bilateral relationship. One of the risks of a very functional relationship is sometimes stakeholders often take things for granted. Consider, for example, the way we frame our bilateral relationship with China and Australia. Both are very, important partners to Malaysia, but they are at the level of a strategic, comprehensive partnership. So I guess the question I would ask is there sort of political will on both sides to elevate or deepen the relationship and to sort of formalize that process? Or are sort of folks happy with the way things are because they are functional? I think one of the important outcomes of this visit is the resumption of the senior officials dialogue between both countries. This is going to be pretty significant because having consultations that are framed, that happen on an annual basis, are an important aspect of bilateral relations and building the foundations for these elevated ties and dealing with challenges in the relationship.
Thomas, thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. Foreign policy analyst Thomas Daniel from ISIS Malaysia there. And that wraps up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night.